Welcome to the Economist in Your Ear podcast. As the global economic landscape keeps shifting, how should we really understand China's economic transition? Is it, heading towards deindustrialization? Or is something maybe more complex, more dynamic, actually unfolding? Today, we're looking closely at a recent piece from The Economist. It really zeroes in on China's economic future, especially this evolving crucial role of the service sector.
Exactly. And the Economist article, well, it puts forward this idea that China might be facing a deindustrialized future. It frames this against some pretty big challenges, right? Ongoing trade friction, that significant property market snap we've all seen, and what it sees as maybe limits to China's high-tech manufacturing boom. But what's really interesting is the article's point about a shift in official language within China, increasingly talking up services as, a key engine for future growth.
That's quite a stark framing from The Economist. A deindustrialized future. Okay, so let's really unpack this. We'll get into the article's main points, how it sets things up. But importantly, we also want to challenge some of that framing a bit, pull in some of the perspectives, give you a fuller picture of what seems to be happening on the ground. You'll hear about where China is finding success, where it's making these strategic shifts, and what it all really means, for the long run. So let's start with The Economist's view. They note the success of things like Made in China 2025, which was all about boosting manufacturing. And they even mentioned strong growth, like 8.9% in high-tech manufacturing last year. But then they say there are limits starting to bite. What kind of limits are they talking about?
Well, they flag a couple of things. One is this term involutionary competition, which isn't just, normal competition. It's more like this intense, almost self-defeating internal scrap. You see it sometimes where there's maybe overcapacity. Companies push prices down so low, it actually ends up hurting innovation, hurting profits. It's maybe a sign that some traditional engines are struggling a bit. And another thing they mentioned was a drop in fixed asset investment in manufacturing back in July. So signs of maybe slowing momentum in certain industrial pockets.
Okay, that paints a picture of some pressure building. So how are China's leaders reportedly responding to these perceived limits? Is the idea just to let manufacturing fade, or is there a new direction?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. They are increasingly emphasizing services as, a major alternative source of growth. But it's not really presented as an either. The article points to that July Politburo announcement. It specifically talked about wanting to foster new growth areas for service consumption. And it's not just talk. We're seeing actual policies like these subsidized loans for consumer services, things like entertainment, tourism, sports, even elder care and childcare. So that does signal a deliberate strategic move, trying to boost domestic demand, create value in services.
And services aren't exactly starting from scratch in China's economy, are they? What does the article say about their current size?
No, not at all. That's a really key point. The tertiary sector, that's the formal name for services, it already makes up, around 57% of China's GDP? Right. Huge. And it employs nearly half the population, about 49%. And importantly, a lot of these jobs require education. Something like 36% of people in services have some college education. So this new emphasis, it's building on a really substantial base.
And there's this other layer too, right? That the actual contribution of services might be even bigger than the official stats suggest. Why is that?
Absolutely. That's crucial context. For a long time, China's statistics system, which was based on an old Soviet model, mainly tracked material services, think transport, restaurants. It missed a huge chunk, maybe 60% of what we'd call the service economy today. And even now, some experts, like Nick Lordy at PIIE, point out that things like owner-occupied housing services, imputed rent, are still likely undercounted, maybe by several GDP points. So the real weight of services in the economy, probably even higher, which makes this rebalancing effort potentially even more significant, maybe overdue.
Okay, right. This is where it gets really interesting for me. That title from The Economist, Can China Cope with a Deindustrialized Future? It sets such a specific tone, doesn't it? But is deindustrialized future really the most accurate way to think about where China's headed? It sounds a bit like, decline or walking away from industry. That feels strong.
It definitely sets a narrative. But, I'd argue China isn't really deindustrializing. It feels more like a remixing. The evidence, when you look closer, it tells a more complicated story. For example, high-tech manufacturing. Value added still grew 8.9% in 2024. That actually beat overall industry growth. And at the same time, investment in high-tech services also saw double-digit growth. So it doesn't look like one replacing the other. It looks more like two tracks rising together, a broadening, maybe an upgrading of the economy, not abandoning industry.
That feels like a really important distinction. You mentioned that July Politburo statement earlier. How exactly did it talk about services? Does that wording challenge this abandonment idea?
Yeah, it's a key difference in framing. That Politburo statement, it didn't say let's ditch manufacturing or move resources out of industry. The wording was specific, cultivating new growth points for service consumption.
Yeah.
And as Fred Gao at Reuters pointed out, the policies that followed, those loan subsidies, directly target consumer services. It looks like a deliberate effort to, foster new areas of growth, diversify the economy's drivers, not pull back from manufacturing wholesale, especially in those advanced areas, which were still a huge priority.
Right. So the overall picture is more like a deliberate rebalancing act. And with services already being so big and showing momentum, there's a strong foundation for that.
Precisely. I mean, the tertiary sector hitting nearly 56.7% of GDP in 2024. That's what, 76.6 trillion yuan out of about 135 trillion.
Yeah.
And you see real strength in areas like information, software, IT services. It forms a really solid basis for, a realistic rebalancing path. It's about optimizing the structure, not just dismantling industry.
Okay. That brings us to another key concept the economist brings up. William Baumel's cost disease. Can you just quickly explain what that is and why it's often seen as a hurdle when economies shift more to services?
Sure. Baumel's cost disease, it's basically this economic idea. It describes how the cost of some services, especially the really labor-intensive ones, tends to go up over time, even if their productivity doesn't really improve much. Why? Because wages in those service jobs generally have to keep up with wages in sectors where productivity is rising fast, like manufacturing with automation, just to keep workers. But think about, say, a live orchestra performance. We're teaching a class. You still need roughly the same number of people doing the work as you did maybe decades ago. The classic example is that Boccherini String Quartet needs the same labor today as in 1800. So as overall wages rise, these services get relatively more expensive, and that can potentially be a drag on overall growth or push up prices.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense for those kinds of traditional services. But is this cost disease like an automatic problem for China moving towards services, or is there more to it now?
Well, what's fascinating is, yes, Baumol effects are real. Some services definitely get pricier without getting much more productive in the traditional sense. But cost disease isn't necessarily China's destiny here. We really need to look beyond that traditional view, especially when we talk about modern services and this idea of servicification. Modern services, things that are tradable, digital, they can actually boost productivity significantly. They aren't just victims of rising costs.
Okay, what kinds of services are we talking about there? The productivity boosting kind.
Think about things like cloud computing, advanced fintech, sophisticated logistics, industrial design, high-tech after-sales support, AI operations. These aren't just local hands-on jobs. They use technology, they create efficiencies, they can often scale up globally. And this ties into servicification, embedding services within manufacturing. Global research shows this trend raises manufacturing value, makes exports more competitive. China's definitely part of this global shift, turning services from just costs into actual value drivers.
And there's data backing this up too, right? Showing China services aren't just local cost centers. What do the trade numbers show?
Yeah, the data is pretty compelling here. China services trade hit a record 7.5 trillion yuan in 2024. That was up over 14% year on year. And reports suggest continued gains in the first half of this year, too. So this isn't just, haircuts getting more expensive. This points to outward-looking, scalable, often knowledge-based services that are adding real economic value, competing globally. It really challenges the idea that services are just stuck with Baumel's law.
Okay. Now, The Economist did mention some softer data points for July, like investment growth cooling off a bit, maybe retail sales dipping. How should we read those kinds of short-term blips in this bigger transition story? Are they red flags?
Yeah, that July wobble, it was definitely real. There was a noticeable slowdown in a few areas, like consumer spending and some parts of manufacturing investment. But I think it's important to see it more as perhaps a mid-year adjustment, maybe part of a policy transition phase, rather than some final verdict against services or high-tech industry. Policymakers seem to be using more targeted tools now, like those loan subsidies we talked about, nudges for demand, rather than just flooding the system with broad stimulus. So it suggests maybe a more careful, calibrated approach to managing this shift, trying to avoid those big boom-bust cycles. Less about a fundamental crisis, maybe more about navigating a complex patch.
That makes sense. So putting it all together, this idea of remixing, targeted policy, leveraging modern services, what does it mean for China going forward? How can they really make services work with their industrial strengths, not against them?
Right. This gets us to some key takeaways for making this services-led upgrade work well, focusing on, quality growth. First, it seems crucial that manufacturing pulls services up, prioritizing what are called producer services. Things like advanced industrial software, testing and certification services, sophisticated logistics, innovative design, digital after-sales platforms. These aren't separate. They're deeply woven into making factories more productive, products more valuable, and exports more competitive. It's about that synergy.
Getting the best of both worlds, essentially. Okay, what else?
Second, there looks to be huge potential in scaling up tradable digital services. China's already gaining ground exporting digitally delivered services, ICT, business services, professional services, so the focus could be on making it easier, cheaper for firms to sell these services across borders. That expands markets, creates economies of scale, boosts competitiveness in these higher value areas.
And what about the numbers themselves? You mentioned undercounting earlier. How important is getting that right?
Hugely important. That's the third point. Keep improving the statistics, getting a better handle on things like imputed housing rent, and just generally aligning the National Bureau of Statistics more closely with international standards. That gives policymakers and us a much clearer, more accurate picture of what's really happening with consumption, with service value add. You need good data to fine-tune policy effectively.
Makes sense. And finally, the money side. How should they finance this? Big stimulus or?
Well, the fourth takeaway seems to be targeted finance over blanket stimulus. The current approach, using things like interest subsidies for specific service sector loans, combined with measures to encourage consumption, it supports a more careful, quality-focused transition. It helps avoid just, overheating things or creating new bubbles, while still steering investment and activity towards where it's needed for that sustainable rebalancing. It feels more sophisticated.
Wow. Okay. So when you put it all together like that, it really does seem like China's path is much less about deindustrialization in the sense of decline, and much more about a deep integration between industry and services. It's like broadening the growth model, adapting, not just abandoning factories. I mean, high-tech manufacturing is still growing, services trade is hitting records, policy is actively nurturing service consumption. The picture definitely looks more like evolution, maybe upgrading.
Exactly. And maybe to connect it back one last time to the Economist's piece, here's a final thought to chew on. They mentioned that Baumol's cost disease, while it sounds negative, is actually driven by rising wages, which itself is a sign of dynamism somewhere else in the economy, right? So could this very dynamic services becoming a bigger, more valuable part of the economy, even if some get pricier, actually be the thing that ultimately allows China's economy, measured at market exchange rates, to surpass the U.S., as the article kind of hinted at? Maybe it's not a disease at all, but actually a symptom of success, a sign of a maturing economy shifting towards higher value creation. Something to think about.
Thanks for listening. Follow us to stay updated with the latest insights on The Economist every day. And don't forget to like, comment, and share.